Hi, friends. I think the talk from Neri Oxman with Andrian was a wonderful gateway to this talk now. It's called the interspecies design. And for you, dear DLD community, Paola is not an unknown speaker. She is part of our community. She influenced us in so many ways. I learned so much from her. She is the senior curator of the Department for Architecture and Design, as well as the Director of Research and Development at MoMA. You had heard how much Neri referred to her collaboration with her. Paola and I are friends for a long time. She spoke at the second DLD 2006. Wow, 2006, 15 years ago, and has been back many times. We are together in the board in the Aufsichtsrat of the wonderful initiative of the Life Science Museum in Munich called Biotopa. We all have to work that it will happen. And I invited Paola this time because she always works at the forefront of societal change. That's her design-driven approach. And she is always ahead of her time. Her work is an intersection of art, design, technology, science, and nature. Her latest MoMA exhibition is Broken Nature, which opened last November. And she will speak about this amazing topic, interspecies design, with Lucia Pietroiusti. Lucia is a DLD newbie, but also I know her for a long time through my dear friend Hans-Ulrich Obrist, because Lucia is the curator of general ecology at the Serpentine Galleries in London. We met many times, and I always was happy seeing you, Lucia. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steffi. It's so good to see you. Ciao, Lucia. And it was really wonderful it's wonderful to be a segue to Neri. Actually, Neri is even part of our presentation. And we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. We're going to say next to the slide. But first of all, we are here. Lucia and I are here. We know each other only marginally, passing by, but of course we know each other's work. But what we would like to share with you is a path we're going on together. We're trying to understand what interspecies really means. And so when we were preparing this conversation, we decided to do a back and forth. I would serve some of my examples. Lucia would respond with her examples with a crescendo of closeness to the Holy Grail, an asymptote to the idea of interspecies design, which we have not yet mastered completely in our soul and in our mind, but we're getting there. So let's start with the presentation, please, and move immediately to the second slide. So I think that we have a little bit of an issue with technical, so I cannot see what you're seeing, and I don't know. Oh, we're hearing that the presentation is not working at the moment. Apparently, this platform crashed on us all, but it doesn't really matter. We can keep on just talking about everything. So as Steffi explained, Lucia works at the Serpentine and I work at the Museum of Modern Art. Lucia mostly deals with art and I mostly deal with design, but we know very well that the two worlds are really coming together right now, and that the distinction is not anymore based on the medium that is used or the subject. Frankly, the division, the distinction is disappearing slowly but surely. And we are trying probably to come together to an understanding. Lucia has been already running a lot of wonderful programs that deal with this concept of interspecies and also with general ecology, a concept that she will explain to you very quickly afterwards. But Lucia, can you please mention the title of the gorgeous symposium that you had? I always get kind of wrapped up in the title just a few months ago.
Hello, Paola. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's incredibly exciting to be able to talk about this with you, of all people, and to come immediately after Neri's gorgeous presentation of her own work. The event that the writer Filipa Ramos and I co-curated is called The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish. And it was really based on this idea of of a puffer fish that draws these gorgeous shapes on the surface of on the bottom of the sea. And I was really puzzled, actually, in a psychotherapy session to try and figure out this shape that is so much bigger than the fish and that the fish makes by just shuffling around. How does it manifest in the mind of that fish? Probably not in the same way as we see it, but we'll get to that, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, and this is really what this presentation is about, what we don't know yet, but we feel, and we're trying to get there. So the first step on this kind of awareness is symbiosis. And I want to present here a project by Revital Cohen, an artist and designer that's very dear to both me and Lucia, from 2008, where she hypothesized saving from euthanasia some dogs, especially, groundhogs, greyhound dogs that have been have finished their own career, repurposing them as kind of like outsourced respiratory system for people that have trouble. So finding a new life and new purpose for animals in our own life, and a codependency that is nonetheless still betraying a sort of superiority of the human being on the animal. Can we go to the next slide first? And here is Lucia's response.
And I think it's a work that I find so incredibly powerful, also because it asks some very difficult questions about how animals fit within supply chains and processes of production. And of course, as Dana Haraway reminds us, there is no such thing as sort of a separation between animal or more than human species and humans anymore, because we are in this kind of deep anthropogenic kind of moment. But that led me to, it prompted me to bring up with you the question of how this notion of design for some kind of symbiosis fits within a context of organizational design, where it is the organization itself that is being adapted to respond more flexibly to ecological imperatives. And it brought me to just talk very briefly about the General Ecology Project, which is a project that emerges out of a lot of engagement that we've had with ecology at the Serpentine, but that I founded in 2018, and that became my kind of strange job title. The aim of creating this project was to embed ecological principles and methods throughout all of the gallery's programs, infrastructure, and network. And as such, the project aims to grow in 3 directions at once. And I quite like to think of a tree in a forest to kind of visualize that. So upwards, the trunk and the leaves of the tree, through programming that is kind of obsessively and regularly thematized around subjects connected to the environment, environmental justice, and thusly nurturing a community of audience that then mirrors back to the institution an image of itself as one that is committed to the ecological, which then helps it grow downwards like the root system of a tree through infrastructural work, those slow, sometimes quite boring transformations that we have to take internally regarding how we work together, what our missions are, who our stakeholders are, whether they're all humans or actually more than human, what our footprint is. So how can we speak of planetary sustainability and resilience rather than organizational sustainability and resilience, or both at once? How can we even go towards thrivability of both at the same time? And then there's the sideways, which is like the mycelium network that regulates, I suppose, the forest's ecosystem through collaborative partnerships and through really experimenting with distributed work and distributed forms of governance across different disciplines and fields. So really leaving the art environment, but only to bring the art environment into all these other fields. And if you go to the next slide, Jacqueline, you can see that I've just put there a tiny fraction of the outputs that have come out and that we've been working on, from research and publications through to festivals and podcasts. But with the last slide in mind, you all of a sudden realize that what is public, these things that you see here, are actually part of this larger holobiont that tries to design an organization, but an organization as a kind of part of a larger, complex, and of course, fragile planetary entanglement.
And we go to the next step, which is to try and find a common language with animals and with other species. And here I propose to Lucia a project by Sputniko, Crowdbot Jenny from 2010. Sputniko is a really interesting designer, artist, scientist, and even singer from Japan and the UK. And Crowdbot Jenny is a project from 2010 in which she hypothesized and realized a machine that had about 7 calls for crows so she could really communicate with them. So it's about finding a community with other species and being able to really talk with them. So this is the second step in our process. And here is Lucia's response. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So that's a compelling work, and one that immediately prompted me to reflect on artworks, which, again, these overlapping fields, as you said, Paola, investigate similar concerns. And I was thinking of Jenna Sutela, Nimia Sethi, of which you see is still here, in which she sought to document the interactions between a neural network, audio recordings of a Martian language as channeled by a French medium in the 19th century, and footage of a space-resistant bacterium commonly found in fermented soybean. And what fascinates me here is the relationship between these three different kinds of more than human. So we really see that the concept of interspecies gets a little bit more complicated as we seek this common language. So artificial intelligence, I suppose ineffable spiritual experience, or interstellar experience, if you like, and non-human forms of life on Earth. But on the other hand, in the context of plants, I kind of self-corrected and thought about philosopher Michael Marder reminding us that sometimes we need to make space for the untranslatable. So The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish that I mentioned before, we've been curating it with Filipa Ramos, and it's a project and festival series that is dedicated to the notion of more than human consciousness or intelligence. When we did the first event, we wanted to look at interspecies communication and language. And you see here on the beside Jenna's slide a choreography by Simone Forti based on a very keen observation of the movement of animals in zoos. And through that event, one of the clearest realizations that I think both Filipa and I had from this, whilst speaking with scientists, artists, and philosophers, all of whom are trying to communicate with a more than human, was also actually through the experience of motherhood, of having a very young baby who doesn't speak, was actually that care and forms of tending are also kinds of communication and language, that responsibility and obligation to those more than human beings or really tiny human beings are forms of communications as well, and so forth.
Caring as communication, and we go to the next slide, helps us really establish an empathy that is almost natural and helps us think of becoming, becoming the animal, becoming the other. Next slide, please, is really an ambition, an aspiration for so many of us. And Thomas Thwaites is a really interesting example, designer, teacher, all together alien and happy to be so. Thomas engaged in becoming a goat a few years ago. He decided he wanted to escape the angst of being a human being and worked with a zoologist, figured out also an outsourced gastrointestinal system so he could eat what goats eat. And then he decamped with that prosthesis to the Alps for 4 days to live with the goats, actually to become a goat. And the goats, interestingly accepted him. This is still a gesture of moving towards, of trying to level oneself. Who's higher? What's the aspiration? It really gives us a little bit of doubt as to the position relative of the two species. So we're getting there, but not there yet. And on to you, Lucia.
Yes, and in the next slide, you will see an artwork by Fernando Palma Rodriguez. It just came to mind as we were talking about the Goatman project. Fernando Palma Rodriguez is an artist who was trained in engineering, and so whose work really involves robotics, but whose references are also connected with indigenous traditions in Central America. And his installations bring together this interest in robotics and this interest in animism in what I find to be very radical ways, in a kind of indigenous futurist aesthetic, which actually raised a question that I asked myself a lot. I'm going to try it out, Paola, because I'm not entirely sure that I am even able to ask the question, let alone answer it. But in post-humanism, is it enough to do away with the centrality of the human subject? Is it enough today to say we are not the center of everything? Who is that anthropos of anthropocentrism when we consider the fact that actually colonialism, extraction, and all of those forces, all of those histories underpin much of the climate crisis, and that so many humans are at the receiving end of the climate disaster. And so inspired by Fernando's work, but also by so many others and so many activists, I am also very interested in what a notion of like some kind of radical anthropomorphism instead could bring. One that you can perceive maybe sometimes when you think of the legal frameworks for the personhood of rivers or mountains. That is much more connected with, of course, indigenous wisdom traditions and notions of stewardship, with traditions of animism. So do we want to de-anthropocenter, or do we want to radically anthropomorphize? And when we say radically anthropomorphize, when we say something like a forest is capable of generosity or intelligence, or is able to chant, are we just making a kind of cheap gesture? Or are we actually acknowledging the fact that things like love, generosity, song are actually not only human? Right?
It's so beautiful.
Thing that meets at the point of justice, I think, climate justice, and it's really important to kind of hold that here, maybe.
It's very important. It's very interesting. Is our frame of reference desperately anthropocentric still? Let's go to the next slide. Another way to perhaps really feel is to be in a community. Next slide, please. And being a community with other beings, I'm going to go back to living beings right now, albeit to very, very small living being, is to think of the holobiont, of the ecosystem, of the dependency that we have with other human beings. This is the work of Kevin Slavin, an old friend of mine and Neri, with whom we also organized several programs together. Holobiont urbanism is the idea of really thinking of the holobiont, of what happens when species come together to such an extent that it's not even anymore a community, it's a shared genome. So understanding the microbiome of New York City, seeing really how the interaction of human beings with microbes and bacteria and other beings becomes a new thing unto itself. And in this attempt to understand what the frame of reference can be to really think of a possible future and to environmental justice, this step can help us too. Lucia, your response.
Yeah, well, I was reminded of this project called Metabolic Selves. And actually, now that you're describing the project again, the second iteration of The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish was on interior multitude and swarming organisms. So do we really know what we mean when we say I, or are we actually this kind of messy swarm of lots of different organisms? And then by, let's say, contrast or by mirroring that, can we think of the whole planet as a kind of single organism, the well-being of one part obviously being necessarily affecting the well-being of another, and so on. And so this question of interdependence within something like Gaia theory. But Metabolic Selves was a project that emerged out of a year of working together with students from the Royal College of Art in London's School of Architecture, a specific studio convened by cooking sections, who are spatial practitioners with whom we've been working for a really long time. And through this project, which is it's actually experienced as an interactive website platform, the students proposed to see the cycles of ecology and toxicity as a metabolic process. So that if you follow the microparticles of things, from iron to sulfur to microplastics to microfibers and so on, you actually realize that they travel through us as we traveled through them. And so the website was this compendium of these metabolic relationships. You travel through these 3D renderings of these different particles and explore these archives that really kind of, instead of following the money, they follow the tiny thing. But overall, in their kind of accretion, they really revealed this kind of the porous boundaries of species, the porous boundaries of material, how we, material, environment, landscape, are actually just in constant mutual transformation. And I thought it was a very beautiful project, which I would encourage you all actually to visit, because it's much more fun to wander through than to hear it from me.
Nah, never. But now that we've been trying to level the playing field, let's go to the next slide. So it's a matter of trust at this point. So let's think what happens if we allow other species, but we're still allowing. So we're still considering ourselves slightly superior. We're allowing them to co-design with us. This is what happens with, next slide, please, what Neri just told you about, and this beautiful installation at MoMA of her Silk Pavilion 2. And she's already explained everything to you, but I think this is where we position co-design. And I don't know if you have a response to this or if we should go directly to communion. You have a response to this?
I was really interested in asking you, Paola, asking everybody, asking ourselves a question on this subject of co-design, because in the design process, and this is something that you most likely know much better than I, in those elements that you set as the framework before creative action can happen, as it were. So when you set the ground for collaborative designs, what are the decisions that are made, that have to be made to make the ground? And I think this is more clearly understood because we speak about it more in the notion of training algorithms and data sets. So like the AI may create these creative, spontaneous connections, but the data sets that are fed to the AI and the algorithm that is written in advance of running it, those are choices and decisions that someone needs to make, potential biases that you can actually code into, bake into the AI and so on. And so what is that place between, it's an open question really, but what is that place between kind of setting the framework and then allowing for co-design? It's a question I'd love to put to Neri as well, actually.